don't know. We have a spot for you over here if you want to. Let's see. Hi, my name is Shane Rogers. I'm the president of the Secular Student Alliance at Parkland College, which is a student group here at Parkland. The purpose of our group is to promote and practice the open, rational, and scientific examination of the universe, our place in it, and that to show that ethics and morality can be meaningfully based on rational and humanistic ideals and values. We like to promote skeptical inquiry. We want to provide a community for atheists, agnostics, humanists, skeptics, naturalists, and other free thinkers. And we like to organize activities such as forums for discussion like this, guest speakers, debates that educate Parkland College and the surrounding community. We like to foster the acceptance of free thinkers, and we advocate for the separation between church and state. Membership of our group is open to all Parkland College students, faculty and staff, and community members. It is run by students, and only students have a voting say in what we do. Now, one of the reasons I started this group is that my experience with people tend to have the mistaken belief that atheists are evil. They think that if we don't have a faith in a supernatural being, then we have no reason to be moral. We're here today to discuss the origins of morality. For example, personal and philosophical origins, and it's asking questions such as where do morals come from in general, and where our own come from personally. Our original plan was to host a debate, but for whatever reason, we were not able to convince any of our fellow student groups to join us today. So instead, we'll be hosting a panel discussion. I'm grateful to be joined by Sam Shore, Scott Siechen, Don Nolan, and Marty Malecki. They're going to help us discuss the matter today. I'll let them tell you a little about themselves, but first I want to thank the rest of the Secular Student Alliance at Parkland College for all the help in putting this together, and especially Brianna K. Stodden, who's over here at the table, who really runs our group so that we can all sit and talk about stuff we like to talk about. Thanks, Brianna. Scott, you want to start out?
My name is Scott Siechen. I'm a biology professor here at Parkland, and so clearly my take on this tends to be somewhat biological in nature, and dealing with the evolutionary roots of morality and so forth. I'm just interested in this. I'm also a faculty advisor for this group, and I've really enjoyed getting to know these guys over the last year or so and interacting with them, and hope to continue to do so in the future.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Wanted to thank you all for joining us here today, and thank you also to the SSA at Parkland College for putting on this great event today. My name is Sam Shore, and I'm part of the Illini Secular Student Alliance over at the University of Illinois, as well as coordinator for the Foundation Beyond Belief, a non-religious charity group that operates nationally along with a bunch of other national non-religious organizations. I'm here today representing the atheistic philosophical stance of secular humanism, or just humanism to its friends. Wikipedia defines humanism as embracing human reason, ethics, social justice, and philosophical naturalism, whilst specifically rejecting religious dogma, supernaturalism, pseudoscience, or superstition on the basis of morality, or as the basis of morality and decision-making. It posits that human beings are capable of being ethical and moral without religion or God. It does not, however, assume that humans are either inherently evil or inherently good, nor does it present humans as being superior to nature. Rather, the humanistic life stance emphasizes the unique responsibility facing humanity and the ethical consequences of human decisions. Now, that describes me pretty well, but I prefer Kurt Vonnegut's more brief definition. Being a humanist means trying to behave decently without expectation of reward or punishment after you're dead. But I wasn't always non-religious, so let me back up for a second. I was born and raised in a Jewish household, not particularly strict, but I still went to religious school every week, Friday night services with some frequency. But as I grew up, I found that a lot of the things I agreed with my fellow Jews about were more universal than just our community. You don't need the Ten Commandments to know thou shalt not kill. On the other hand, more specific Jewish traditions rang less true to me. When I looked around at other faiths, I noticed a similar pattern. They shared the same moral groundwork that was pretty solid, but once you added their unique dogmas, I couldn't abide by them anymore. We're lucky to have a for instance today. Just yesterday, people all over our country stood up in the face of intolerance. Although many of marriage equality's allies still consider themselves religious, the roots of their faith traditions are more often than not morally opposed to the concept of same-sex relationships. For that day, when many of us were looking beyond the dogmas of our ancestors and sought fairness for our fellow citizens, we were all humanists. To bring this directly to the point of our discussion, I began to believe that as I grew up, that our morality is internal. There are cultural variations on the same theme based on religious preference, but what makes us really good, that's shared and exists in cultures both religious and not.
So I'm Marty Malecki. I am a University of Illinois student, and my roommate actually happens to be the president of the Illinois Secular Student Alliance over at U of I. I'm here today representing kind of the Catholic point of view on morality. I was born and raised Catholic, and then came to college and kind of redefined my faith and what I want it to be. Very much into my faith at this point. But from when I was born, that's my faith, and my parents, the people around me, the examples they've set have always been set in the Catholic faith. And then, I'm learning my sense of morality from other people within my faith. So I'm a firm believer that faith plays an important role in morality. However, like Sam said, there are definitely some universal aspects of morality that are imposed by societal guidelines or other reasons outside of faith. However, I believe that faith is an important component in morality and perpetuating societal values.
So is this my 5 minutes? Okay. I'm Don Nolan. I've been teaching here since the Jurassic Age, more or less retired, still hanging on because I enjoy teaching, and one of the courses that I'm teaching this semester and have for 40 years at various institutions is Religions of the East. I've also taught Religions of the West. I also teach logic and critical thinking, and introduction to philosophy and ethics and so on. So a little background. I was going to, assuming you had a larger audience, I was going to try to get a little sense of the landscape before we did, but it's clear where everybody is up here, so I'll go ahead and put my cards out on the table. I am a devotee of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. I have been attempting to push the cause of creation theory by the Flying Spaghetti Monster, but me and our followers are having a difficult time. So with that little sardonic attempt at humor, give you some idea of where I fit in the landscape. And I've been asked to show up and make the case from a religious point of view, and I always find these general assignments problematic because religion is a complex phenomenon. My suspicion, knowing what I know about secular humanism and the atheist tradition in the United States and England and France, those are the countries where atheism seems to be spreading, and the French seem to be leading all the rest of us. Secularism is on the rise, and so I think I understand the nature of the Secular Alliance? Secular Alliance, okay. And let me just suggest, I think it is an alliance of those who are concerned mostly about the encroachments, the impositions on our thought and on freedom and liberty of conscience by what I call Abraham, not I, but just the general name, the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, although you will find similar movements in other countries as well, but the politics of atheism and secularism in the United States is pretty uniquely different from almost anywhere else because of the history of the Abrahamic traditions. So having said that, let me just make a couple other remarks, and I understand you want to open it up and have a conversation about this. I've got a little handout here. I don't know if you care for a copy. There you go. There are a couple of what I call top-down arguments that you find in the literature. Some are more respectable than others, and I picked out a couple of respectable ones. Number one, moral law implies the existence of a lawgiver. There you go. And the argument is, roughly, there's no sense of morality among the lions and tigers and bears. There is among human beings. Yeah, help us out here. We need to... Yeah. And they live under the law of the jungle. Human beings have developed a law of morality. So that implies that somehow or another the laws of morality have to have come from somewhere than the jungle or somewhere other than the natural world. So if law entails a lawgiver, then if we just slip in the word G-O-D in place of lawgiver, you've got a top-down theory. You're in the Catholic...
Do you mind if I interrupt with
go ahead.
questions concerning this? I mean, because it seems very clear that nature itself, the jungle itself, is replete with examples of altruistic behavior.
This argument ignores that.
All right.
I was going to get to that.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. Then I'll shut up. Please
if you want to know where I'm coming from, go down to the one bottom-up theory of morality, and I think we'll more or less agree. I was told to make the argument.
Excellent.
So I'm doing
Please
my best.
continue. I'll stay out.
Prosecuting attorney for the top-down, or defense attorney, I should say. There are two other classical ones. One is the Roman Catholic tradition of natural law. There are many other variations of natural law that somehow in the natural world the divine law was stamped, and we human beings have evolved to develop reason, says Thomas Aquinas, in order to decipher the messages of God in the natural world. That suggests that a little bit closer alliance between divine law and nature. And the Jesuit tradition, I don't know if you're acquainted, are you in that tradition at all? Was your household? Yeah, okay. The Jesuits are probably the most articulate defenders of that argument, and they're actually quite interesting. And then, of course, the ancient view of Plato, he believed that there's two realities. There's the reality of ideas and reason and forms, and there's this world of senses, our senses, which are variable. And we can't find any real truth, and we can't know much, if anything at all, about the sensory world. So we have to find out what we can know and what to believe from the higher realm. He called it the form of the good. So there's three. And what makes them interesting is if you look at the first page of this handout, and I'll stop with this, it's fairly clear from social sciences, anthropology, archaeology, history, that there's a cross-cultural similarity from one culture to the next in moral beliefs. I don't know if I need to persuade any relativist here of that, but if I do, we'll take a look at what is called cross-cultural consensus, the emergence of reflective consciousness everywhere in the world. Buddha, Confucius, Isaiah, Jesus, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, all develop a reflective consciousness where they rise to some level of understanding. And the one that is the most important from my point of view is the need for conflict resolution. The history of the human race is very much a history of conflict, not only, So the question is, how do we resolve conflicts? And that's what, in my view, my theory of morality has to do with resolving conflicts of interest between parties, among other things. So if you look at the little triangle down at the bottom of that first page, you have a picture of Lawrence Kohlberg's 6 stages of morality. If you don't know, Kohlberg is the guy who 40 years ago devised this test where college students like you would be paid $10 to come in to take a teaching and learning test. And somebody in the other room was supposed to be wired up to wires, and you're sitting in front of a control panel, and you're supposed to start at 15 volts every time they miss a word pair that they're supposed to memorize. You shock them, you keep going up. And Kohlberg's theory, to make a long story short, is that 60% of you, people walking around this college, are capable of shocking me to death. If an authority with a PhD and a white coat in a lab at a university says you should do so. So it turns out that 10% are at the top, the social contract and principle levels, and they frequently, more often than not, refuse. There's one famous case of a guy who said, first word pair he missed, he put his finger on the 15-volt switch and he stepped back, like, seems to me, Mahatma Gandhi or Mandela or whoever, and said, this experiment is wrong. You shouldn't be doing this. You're hurting people. I won't do it. Here's your money back. Now the question for you and for the atheist in the room, apparently mostly here, is how do you account for so-called principled, self-sacrificial, martyr-like behavior? One of my favorite authors is Daniel Dennett. Do you know Dennett? He's got a series of books. Dennett would say, if he were here, go look in the animal kingdom and you'll find ants and bees and spiders who sacrifice themselves for the common good. There's got to be an evolutionary functional reason or purpose. We don't speak of purposes, do we, in biology, for why they do that. So Dennett argues that's for the greater good. So I leave it to you. Is that really the case? Is our rather highly refined sense of morality culled from the great thinkers, from the great religions and cultures of the world, philosophers, really just reducible to evolutionary phenomena? Is the reason why Mandela, and I'll leave you with this story, came out of the prison that he was in for 18 years, was it? Angry, but listened to Bishop Desmond Tutu and others who said, you got to get rid of the anger, you got to rise above it, and you have to learn to love and compassion. And many commentators say he saved South Africa, Bishop Desmond Tutu saved South Africa. Is that a result of evolutionary functions like ants and bees that sacrifice themselves for the greater good? That's my question. I'll stop.
I'd like to hear from you on that topic.
Nope, sorry.
I agree largely with on the first page, this pyramid of moral values. Why we moral development, and why people act the way they do. And we notice that the very bottom level is avoiding punishment. Part of what makes my belief so valuable to me is, for instance, when you have a parent, your parent tells you, maybe don't run in the house. Okay? So if you do run in the house, you know that you're not supposed to do that, and there will be some sort of punishment to reinforce that, but that your parents aren't going to stop loving you, they aren't going to disown you, they're always going to be your parents and be there for you. So the reason why I don't run in the house is to avoid punishment. Now, in a similar way, I believe that God is like a parent to me. In fact, we call him our Father because we believe that he is truly our Father. So, in a similar way, when God says, thou shalt not kill, to make a really easy one, if you kill, he is going to have some sort of punishment for you, whether that punishment comes through your fellow man being put in prison, whether that comes from just the guilt that you're given and that you feel, and the punishment is very intrinsic, or whether you end up somewhere like purgatory after you die and you have to atone for your sins, he is still going to forgive you. So there is no absolute cutting off. But one of the things that makes my faith so powerful to me is that avoiding punishment is the basis of moral development. And so for me, my moral developed from avoiding punishment from God. And in general, as far as the situations I've encountered, I think that the greatest moral good, which can be argued, comes from obeying God's will and the moral and social laws that he's set up through the Catholic Church.
I see Sam's taking a lot of notes. Did you want to respond?
I will in a second.
Okay. Scott?
Well, I guess first I'd like to respond to Don's question. And Don's question, as I remember it, was, is all of this higher level not sacrifice, but self-detrimental, altruistic behavior, an upshot of our evolutionary roots? It's an excellent question, and the complex, nuanced answer is yes. I suspect that you're well familiar with Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, which is an entire book looking at the evolutionary roots of altruistic or what has been developed in human culture to possibly its pinnacle as truly principled moral behavior, and applies game theory to genes that would either become more common in the population if the individual acts in an altruistic way, or would genes only be benefited by every individual organism being selfish all the time. And when you work it out, I'm very interested in the 60% that would kill you for $10 and the authority to do so.
Under those conditions.
Right, under those conditions. And the 10% that wouldn't even do the first lowest level shot. Variability in the population. And that's the whole point of natural selection, is that there is variability all the time. Now, is the church only an upshot of those internally felt motivations? Is it only an excuse to behave the way my gut instinct tells me I want to? No, it's more. It has more trappings and bells and whistles on it than that. But I do suspect that, as does I believe Dennett, that's at least the roots of the beginnings of what was religion that eventually evolved into our modern conception of religion. That's my personal response.
What year was this experiment? What year did it take place?
Oh, I don't remember the exact year. About 40 years ago.
Okay, and was it in America that it was done? All right, so I think we can throw out the religion hypothesis for why people are good right there, because
what's the religion hypothesis?
Well, that if religion or a religious upbringing is somehow responsible for goodness, certainly 60% of Americans and more were devout at that point in time. Mm-hmm. And so we can assume that 10%, even if they are devout, would be an outlier even from that, and you'd have to question, well, what's actually driving them to be so good? And it's clearly not their religious upbringing, and or at least not their religious upbringing alone. And to Marty's point about needing somebody to punish, somebody to be there as kind of your moral backstop, if that was the case, it seems that, you know, we would see in America, which is a more religious country than some of our allies in Europe, we would have a lower crime rate because we have more people who believe that God is watching over you. However, if you look at crime statistics, very basic social scientific facts, you can see that in fact the opposite is true. We've got a higher murder rate, higher rates of theft, higher rates of all sorts of, you know, societal ills than do our less devout counterparts. So the question comes, so what is it? What is actually, what makes us good? I guess, how apropos. What makes us good? And if you look at the facts of, you know, when you look at these statistics of who's actually being good, the question is how well does theistic belief stand up?
Well, so kind of in response to your question there about if we are, you know, more religious, you know, why 40 years ago was this study showing, you know, that 60% of people would have killed someone, and why do we have such a high crime rate now? Well, I'll start 60 years ago, you know, or 40 years ago. I don't know what it would take to kill someone, and if I'm correct in my understanding, it's not actually the voltage that will kill you, it's more the amperage. So if you were increasing voltage, you wouldn't necessarily know that you were killing someone, only that you were hurting someone. And even then, if you asked this, you know, the 60% of people that, you know, were giving someone a high enough voltage to kill them, or if you ask the people who are committing crimes now, first, are you religious? Do you believe in God? You know, they would either answer yes or no. But more importantly, of the people that said they do believe in God, if you ask them a second question, do you believe that what you did was right? Do you believe that God approves of what you did, or that you disobeyed Him? In my experience, people are sinners, and they are going to do the wrong thing from God's eyes. However, that doesn't mean that they don't think it was wrong. That doesn't mean that they don't have a moral code that they violated. Because murderers don't grow up being murderers. You know, there's something that happened to make them violate a moral code. So in a similar way, there's something that happens that makes you violate God's moral code, and that's why we believe in forgiveness from God, because it's well known that we're going to violate His moral code, and that we have to grow in it. We have to learn. We're going to make mistakes.
Sure. A couple of questions just to stir it up a little bit. I'm more or less in the choir here. Two things. Plato once said, is what is right because God willed it? Or did God will it because it's right? If it's the former, then if at whatever time it is, 2 minutes from now, suddenly all over the world, all the Bibles have been changed, and the commandment that read, thou shalt commit adultery, is now changed to, or not commit adultery is changed to, thou shalt commit adultery, then you have to believe it. But don't we all know that adultery tends to be harmful, and the reason it's wrong is not because God said it, it's because it's wrong, which raises the question, can't we make judgments about right and wrong independently of the dictates of God or an authority figure? That's one. Number two, that's for you, and then for the atheist in the crew. It is frequently said by Jesuits and Buddhists and defenders of Vedanta and Hinduism that some of the greatest crimes in history, particularly in the 20th century, have been committed by secular societies with atheistic leanings. You can mention many of them. There's Stalin and his massacres, Pol Pot in Cambodia, who no one would confuse with being a Buddhist, Hitler, of course. So is there anything about secularism, secular atheism, secular humanism that makes it morally more beneficial, more developed than theistic, even Abrahamic belief? I happened to do a radio program for a friend of mine, I don't know if you know him, Steve Shoemaker, at WLL, and there's two programs that you might be interested in. One was an Orthodox bishop up in Chicago who said the greatest problem that Orthodox Greeks are having in Turkey is not from Islamists, but rather from a secular government in Turkey that is oppressing not only Muslim women who can't wear their veil by law and Christians in Istanbul, which they prefer to call Constantinople. So there's that issue. Sorry, I'm talking about Josh. I'll shut up.
So to kind of take on your first question about what if, in 2 minutes everything had changed, and the Bible now said that adultery is correct. Our religion teaches us to question. So when, for instance, I came to college, I had a lot of questions about my faith. Kind of drew away from it for over a year. But there were things drawing me back to it, drawing me to ask questions. And a lot of what it came down to was things that I didn't understand, the things I hadn't asked the right questions for yet, that I was making generalized, this is bad. For instance, homosexuality. People often think that the Catholic Church is opposed to homosexuality, and that's not quite the case. They're opposed to redefining the sacrament of marriage. Sam and I were actually having a discussion about this earlier. How, what if, to kind of go with your what if everything changed, what would be different if, suddenly, the Catholic Church was sponsoring gay marriage? And the short answer is maybe not a whole lot. If everyone believed this differently, whether morals came first and then God endorsed them, or whether God had a set of laws that we endorse as morals, they're pretty universal. So, for instance, with your comment on adultery, if God proposed a set of morals and adultery was in that set of morals, then we would generally believe that to be okay. If adultery was in our set of morals and then God endorsed that, we would still generally believe that to be okay. However, if in 2 minutes everything changed, you're talking about changing writings, not a set of morals. There are writings that we as Catholics don't believe. To give you a real quick one, Judaism believes in circumcision, as I understand it. However, as Catholics, we don't share that belief. Whether that is written or not, that's not a belief we share. So changing writings doesn't necessarily change a moral standard. We have a moral standard for marriage that giving legal rights perhaps would not change. However, we don't wish to define that as marriage. So that's kind of where we lie on the moral spectrum of change and morals changing.
Sorry, you want to go? I guess I'm a little confused because you said if it had been handed down by God that you should commit adultery, you would do it without question. Right?
So, God has been here from the beginning of time. Just as if your parents, had told you, don't run in the house, and now suddenly they say run in the house, you're going to be a little confused. In a similar way, for at the very least the past 2,000 years, by the Catholic belief, God has been saying, do not commit adultery. So for someone to do an about-face like that, we would question, and for him to have actually changed that, there would be a reason behind it. So if we found that reason might trump our current moral opposition to adultery. However, without that reason, God would not change the writings and the teachings that he's given us to endorse adultery. He wouldn't just kind of for kicks say, hey, go out and commit adultery. There would be a reason behind it. And that's what I believe.
If I could just interrupt for just a second. I see some people standing around the corners. If you guys have any questions or anything and you just want to give me a little hands up, I'll come over and let you put in a point or make a question. And there's also some free cookies over here. What you all said brought up another question to me is if what is moral not because God said so, but God said so because it is moral, then that means by definition that the morality supersedes God, right? And so does that mean that something that God could do could be immoral? What do you guys think about that?
And I'm by no means the most articulate person to ask about this. Morality is relative. Proponents of the death penalty, most of them would say, I'm not going to go out and kill people. But then you say, but this man did all of these wrong things. And then they say, oh yeah, it's all right to kill him. So there's obviously a line here. It's moral to kill someone as a punishment, or it's moral to take away someone's freedom as a punishment. And that's kind of contradictory, because the reason they're being punished is they killed someone, or they took away someone's freedom, or they violated someone's rights. They did something immoral. So we in turn are going to do something immoral back to them as a punishment. Now, in a similar way, some of the things that God does may be a punishment response. They may not be, what we would call moral. We look at, for instance, the flood in the story of Noah's Ark. And that's, sometimes you have to get rid of the bad by whatever means necessary. It's a tougher question than that. If you had a country that, for instance, Nazi Germany, they were doing so much bad that we fought a war costing millions of lives on many sides to be lost. However, we fought that war, we caused those deaths because we knew that the alternative was that the Nazis would continue causing more deaths. So, and you're right, we are not God. However, as Catholics, we believe that if we open ourselves up, God will guide us. He'll guide us as much as we let him. And humans are imperfect. We do make mistakes. But the goal is to be as close to perfection as we can find.
I'd like to backtrack for just a second to I think I've hit upon what's really so problematic about the experiment that you discussed is that it kind of belies a sort of morality from it's top down. It's from a figure of authority. The reason they were willing to do it is because the guy with the white lab coat is there.
Over?
Yeah.
It's top down.
What? Or Yeah, because he's being the people in the experiment are being told.
They're being what?
They're being told by the person in the lab coat. That was your emphasis, that under the circumstances.
Well, they're being paid, and they can freely choose not to do it.
Okay.
So it's not like they're being coerced.
Okay.
And by the way, he thinks of this. He thought of this in ethics and ethical theory. There's two kinds. One is descriptive ethics, where you're trying to describe how other people behave, and there's normative ethics, which is what we're trying to talk about, I think, here. Kohlberg thought of himself as just describing behavior, levels of how people develop. He wasn't trying to impose a morality on these people, although we don't have time to get into this. He's got his critics, but...
Right. Well, I still think that if you walked up to somebody and you didn't have the credentials and the white lab coat and said, here's $10, shock this guy to death, I think you'd get a different result.
Well, it was for the good of mankind. It was a teaching and learning experiment. We're going to do great things with the results.
Okay. All right.
Were they actually told that they would be killing the person, or
no?
Just it was a gradual increase.
It was a teaching and learning experiment, and the person in the other room was not really being killed. He was an actor. And so as the switches went up to 150, 200 volts, the actor would scream, say, I want to stop. And the test was to see who would go how far and what reasons would they give for going on or not going on. And then after he got up to 300 and some odd volts, the actor was instructed to be silent. So you didn't know, did they die or not? They're just not responding anymore. And the remarkable finding about that is that 60% would do this. By the way, there was a famous case of an elderly lady in New York, this was done at Cornell and some other places, who went through the test. She was like 57, 58 years old. And she was able to shock people all the way up almost to the end, but she stopped as she started crying. And then they accused Kohlberg of unethical research at Harvard, which is where he taught. She showed up in his defense and said, I'm going to pull up my sleeve and to show you this is my tattoo from Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. All Professor Kohlberg did is hold a mirror up to you and me and show who we are. And he got off. So he wasn't a normative ethicist. He was just trying to do scientific study of how people evolve in their moral thinking.
Okay. All right. Well, let me address a question you posed to our side before Marty got going about dictatorship and the horrors of the 20th century. And I guess, and the reason I came up here identifying as a humanist rather than an atheist is just because atheism is just, it's one point of fact. It's not an ethos. It's not a philosophy. It is one truth statement. It is, I do not believe that there is sufficient evidence for belief in God. The problem that you can find in non-religious cultures, as with religious cultures, which I'd like to think humanism sidesteps, is that of dogmatism, which is the real problem with the underlying problem with a lot of religion, which would make you think, oh, okay, God says that it's okay to commit adultery, or it's okay to deny loving couples certain legal rights. It's based in a certain dogmatism. And the same is true of these 20th century dictators. They didn't just come in and say, God isn't real, but hey, do what I want to do. Right. They said, they set up iconography, they set up all of this, we are the leaders. They set themselves up as deities.
It's a social pathology, it's
Correct.
Not religion.
Correct. It's a form of dogmatism which emulates the similar kind of structures that religion does.
Once you go down that logic, then aren't there plenty of religious traditions which are not pathological, or are you arguing, as Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, bless his soul, said, all religions are evil?
I don't think that they're all evil to the same degree.
Right. There's one other guy named Christopher Hedges,
Right.
who argues that the crop of new atheists in the United States look like, talk like, walk like a religion with dogma. That's his argument.
I've heard it.
Almost any ism can be turned into something that seems religious, right?
I wouldn't say anything. I'd say that a healthy dose of skepticism and being willing to change your views based on what's observed. Like, take, for example, Christopher Hitchens. As you know, he was a profound proponent of the Iraq War, and at one point he was a proponent of waterboarding.
Right.
And at one point, a group of ex-Navy SEALs came to him and said, well, are you willing to put your money where your mouth is? If you don't think it's torture, will you undergo the experience, and will you write about it?
Sorry, didn't hear that last part.
A group of ex-Navy SEALs who used to train operatives to be able to withstand torture came to Christopher Hitchens and asked him, would you be willing to be waterboarded?
To be what? Oh,
waterboarded. To see for yourself whether you find it to be torture or not. And Christopher Hitchens was willing to undergo it. And as soon as he had the experience, he turned around and he said, I was dead wrong. Mm-hmm. I am very sorry that I was ever in proponents or advocacy of that. Mm-hmm. And this is something that we shouldn't do. And based on the evidence that was observed, he changed his view on something that was very heartfelt. So I wouldn't call that dogma.
Let me just mention to you, I also interviewed a MIT physicist recently called Max Tegmark, who in his astronomy class at Harvard, the first day, he sort of laid out the cosmological theory of modern physics. And a student came up to him and said, Professor, I'm not sure I can stay in here because what you're telling me is contrary to what I believe about the origins of the universe. He had a problem with Big Bang Theory and evolution. And Max Tegmark asked him, what's your denomination? He's, I think, Church of Christ, conservative wing. And he happened to have done his research. He said, do you know that your official church doctrine supports Big Bang Theory and evolution? And the student, he said, just relaxed, and the anxiety went away, and he said, oh, thank goodness, I didn't realize that. So Tegmark was curious about this, so he did a very extensive survey in which he discovered across the country, what was it, 70% of people who claim to be religious or theists, huge number, accepted the Big Bang Theory and evolution and rejected intelligent design. A small percentage is, I think, between 11 and 15% are the evangelicals who see science and religion fundamentally in conflict. So someone said, don't publish this because you're going to get all the fundamentalists angry at you and you're going to get all this hate mail. He published it anyway in the Huffington Post, and he got plenty of hate mail, but it wasn't from fundamentalists, it was from angry atheists. So I think dogmatism is a human trait. I'm not sure that it's totally layable at the steps of religion. Obviously, Stalin and Hitler were dogmatists. No, sorry.
I just have a really interesting stuff, and I agree that dogmatism is the issue, and it may well be rife in the atheistic community. Dogmatism, right? A lack of skeptical, critical thinking, right? Is there some value in removing one source of dogmatism, or do we need to mind our own house first? That's my question back on your excellent point.
Well, and one of the things I've noticed, being in the Catholic faith as well as seeing the Secular Student Alliance at University of Illinois, the president of that organization being one of my best friends, is that there are certain, I guess, beliefs that are shared and actions that are shared. For instance, we were talking about kind of the similarities between the Catholic Church at a university through the Newman Center versus a secular student alliance club. Like I went on a retreat with my church, and I was talking with Derek, my roommate, and I asked him, well, why don't you guys do something similar? And he said, well, our similarities there are going to conferences. You go on a retreat to learn more about your faith. We go to conferences to learn more about science, arguments against religion, different things like that. And then there are other similarities. We have a weekly meeting every Sundays. A Secular Student Alliance has a weekly meeting maybe every Thursday. We have a speaker who's in some position of power that gives a homily, or in other words, a guiding lecture on morals and moral principles. And the Secular Student Alliance frequently has speakers come in to talk on morals, moral principles, religion, bases of religion, bases of atheism, whatever it may be. I completely agree with your statement that the new crop of atheists has a dogma of their own. It may not be following a gospel or a book from God, but it might be following an encyclopedia or scientific research written by men. Arguably, atheists would argue that scientific research is more concrete than perhaps a book handed down by God. But at the end of the day, we're both following a set of writings. We both have similar practices and traditions, and we're both looking for a sense of community, because the whole purpose of a Secular Student Alliance is to give a similar community to the one that many people find in their faith.
Well, I guess I got a problem with that characterization of science. I think that one of the greatest discoveries, if that's the word, or products of human civilization is the scientific spirit, the scientific tradition. It is true, scientists tend to become dogmatic in their work, but the ethos and ethics of science is all about self-criticism, testing, making public exposure by replicating claims, hypotheses in multiple contexts, and if the hypothesis survives multiple tests, then provisionally we accept it. There are no absolutes in science. Any scientist who tells you that there are absolutes in science are wrong. And I know we're at the end of our hour. The Dalai Lama recently said, if Buddhism and science conflict, then Buddhism has to change. I think it's one of the more remarkable, because they're both in search for truth, and if we discover there's scientific truth, then Buddhism has to change. When I hear words like that coming from our new Pope, then I'll feel better about the Catholic tradition.
I want to thank everyone for coming today, and we have reached the end of our time. And I'd just like to remind everyone that this was hosted by the Secular Student Alliance at Parkland College, and that we do meet every week on Tuesdays from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock in room L159. Is that right? Okay, I know where it is. I can't always remember the room number. So I thank everybody for coming today, and more information about our group can be had right back here, as well as free cookies. So thank you.